Thank you for spending the evening here with us. There's a few things that I want to say before we get into the program. First thing is we have refreshments available, even though you probably can't reach them now, and those are complimentary. We also have bathroom facilities if you go back towards the kitchen into the back corner, but you probably can't reach that either, so. This is the last program that we have for the 2022 season. It's been a very successful season. Let's see here. And I want to thank everybody who has helped contribute to our successful season, either by attending our meetings or attending our events and donating money, time, and we really appreciate it. Here's my shameless pitch. The Society offers these programs free of charge, but any donations that you offer are greatly appreciated. And if you'd like to make any contributions, we have a couple of donation jars. Tonight's program we are videotaping, and as soon as that is posted on YouTube, I will put the link on our Facebook page and on our website. So if you enjoyed it and you want to tell your friends, they can see it as well. So just to give you a little bit of background here, back in April we had a 2-day art exhibit, and it was artist Sarah Louise Tremblay, who is a local artist here in Acton. And what I did was I asked her to do some paintings and show them here. And so she did some people, some landscapes and landmarks. But she also took some of the folk tales and legends that were known in Acton and Shapley, and she put them on canvas. This horse is one of them. And so while the horse was hanging at the exhibit, Steve Huntress and his family visited. And so the painting got Steve talking about local history.
That's pretty usual.
They know Steve, you know. So he spoke to Sarah and me and anyone else within earshot. And he particularly had interest in the story of the ghost of Shapley Plains, a subject that he spent the last 20 years or so researching. So we know that Maine has a fair share of folk tales and myths and legends, and if you do a Google search you'll find quite a few of them. Some are about people doing great things, and others are from events, usually tragic, that sprout more fables and folk tales. And Shapley's tale falls into that latter category. It was over 200 years ago, and the telling has morphed over that time because it's been oral mostly. The first time I think that it was actually published was in one of the Sanford newspapers back in around 1906. So up until that point, it's never been put into any like story or book of folk tales and legends. So with that, there's been a lot of speculation, and the details are fuzzy as to who did what when. And some of you might know the story, and others may have heard of it, and then others have no clue what we're here for today. So tonight we'll hear a good ghost story for our Halloween weekend. So Steve will tell the story as it was published by Julia Anna Cook, and he'll share with us his research. He hasn't got all the answers, but some of his discoveries I hope will be eye-openers for us. And so we'll appreciate this tale, and we'll keep telling it for generations. So I'm going to hand this over to Steve.
All right.
Thank you.
Nice job. That way I can have the computer, because there are a couple of things. This was an interesting request to do this tonight, and when we first started doing this, we certainly were not anticipating this kind of crowd here, so this is fantastic. So I wrote everything down, and I'm going to read it as we go. I could probably do this exegetically, so to speak, but there's a lot of little details that if I miss, it's going to make it a little bit more confusing. So I'd rather try to get the details down as clearly as possible. So normally I wouldn't sit up here and just read from a document, but that's unfortunately pretty much what I'm going to do tonight, just so you're aware. So.
I love that stuff, thank you.
Yeah, I got it right, yeah.
Like 15 of those a week.
Yeah, I know it, me too. In 1985, I was a 14-year-old Boy Scout working on my Citizenship in the Community merit badge. One of the requirements for that particular merit badge was to attend a town meeting and write a report on the proceedings. Since there were a number of us in the troop at that time, all working on the merit badge, our scoutmaster, Dave Wade, who's standing in the back over there, used the opportunity to get some exposure for the troop, and we all went to the town meeting in uniform and helped set up chairs, pass out town reports, and anything else that could be found for us to do. The town report that I helped pass out that year was a special one, because 1985 was Shapley's bicentennial, and in it there were all kinds of interesting things on the history of Shapley. One of the things was a story written by Julia Cook on the disappearance of the Reverend Mr. Bryant, the tale from which springs the ghost of the Shapley Plains legend. If you grew up in this town, you grew up listening to this tale every Halloween, around every campfire, and from every old-timer that loved to tell tall stories to kids. This is just one of those things that's a part of this town's history. So tonight, what I want to do is I want to start by reading Julia Cook's stories. Has anybody ever read her story? Okay, there's a few people who have. So for those of you who haven't heard, and I want to start by reading that story. Then I want to go through some research on some people that at first, as I'm going through this, you might be wondering, why is he talking about these people at all? This has nothing to do with the story. And then at the end, I want to kind of tie things up a little bit and tell you what I think happened in 1801 to this preacher who was an itinerant preacher riding through town. Okay, so first, we'll go ahead and read Julia Cook's story. It's quite a lengthy story, but it's not too bad. So, and it starts off, it says, in York County, Maine, the officially unrecorded story of a pitiless murder and the later appearance of the victim's ghost still persist. It was supposed to have happened in the year 1801 when Thomas Jefferson was president of our country. At that time, records were well kept in the settlements south of what now is the state of Maine. But settlers in the North Country were few and far between, and folks were just too busy keeping alive to write down many things that happened. Also, many early records have been lost or been destroyed by fire. One folk tale based in fact that has, for the last 196 years, that was back in 85, so, has been spoken of whenever people living in or near Shapley have been reminded of unexpected or unexplained happenings. It has been written down by few, and the victim is always referred to simply as the Reverend Mr. Bryant, an itinerant Baptist preacher. He lived in a small settlement on the Ossipee River over 30 miles north of the Shapley Plains, and traveled on horseback preaching the gospel to those pioneers hardy enough to clear the spaces in the wilderness for their small homes and farms. Mr. Bryant was also a peddler, carrying in a small sack kitchenware, needles, medicines, things like this that were very hard to come by in the area where they were still sharing the land with the Indians, with wild animals in the forest. Rough roads hewn between the trees were in some places no more than cow paths. The fervor of Mr. Bryant's sincere beliefs upheld him through the hardships of many hazardous journeys, made so that he could warn against the voice of the evil one, especially his urgings to sample deeply of the rum bottle. This was a temptation to which the woodsmen were known to sometimes give way, as they lived a grim and dangerous life with few pleasures. In fact, some in their secret hearts resented Mr. Bryant's influence on their womenfolk and the way the rum jug often disappeared when they were working away from home. Near the close of a chilly autumn day, the weary preacher urged his tired horse down the main street of the small Shapley settlement at the head of the Mauser River, as he had done many times before when returning home from that part of his circuit, which took him to the more southerly towns near the New Hampshire border. He dismounted at the inn at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Hasty. Here he spent the night, and the innkeeper cared for his horse. Mr. Bryant awakened early, wishing to make an early start on the next day's journey, and while he was breaking his fast in the common room, his host offered to accompany him on the first part of his travels. The road meandered through the plains, which were thickly covered with pine and scrub oak. The innkeeper explained that since Mr. Bryant's last visit, several other paths had opened up, and it would be very easy for him to lose his way and possibly become the victim of a stray Indian or prowling bears or bobcats. Mr. Hasty saddled his own horse and that of the Reverend Bryant, and the two men set off on their tragic journey. Several days later, the 15 or so pioneers who had gathered together by Mr. Day and Deacon Hill to hear the preaching of Mr. Bryant waited with growing impatience for his appearance. They themselves had traveled long distances bringing their families and food for the day. None relished the idea of having to return home after dark. The hours passed and Mr. Bryant did not arrive. However, a messenger reined in his weary horse at the home of Deacon Hill. Mr. Bryant's mother and sisters had sent him seeking word of the preacher. They were concerned for his safety as he was long overdue at home. The disappointed worshipers returned to their scattered homes, and the messenger continued his search for the missing man of God. But he was not to be found, and years passed by with no word of a riderless horse trotting into the settlements at Shapley Corner. Then later, some of Mr. Hasty's neighbors began to look on him with suspicion. Mrs. Hasty had let slip that the fact that she had found a bundle and a hat that looked like the minister's weeks after he had spent the night there. She knew he had taken them with him when he had said goodbye to her. Her husband had soon put a stop to this, however, discussing this puzzling matter with the neighbors. Soon many strange tales were whispered around. At dusk, travelers were thrown or almost thrown from their horses at a certain spot at the plains known as Bryant's Hollow. On a bleak autumn day, a settler called Joe lingered too long over his errands in visiting at Shapley Corner and started home at dusk. His horse trotted along briskly, but a short time after they entered the haunted road, he began to act strangely. Joe urged him on. Suddenly the horse reared, almost throwing the rider. Joe again tried to urge him on, but the frightened animal would not move an inch forward. That's the painting. The uneasy rider dismounted and tried to soothe his shivering animal. It was then that he saw standing directly in front of the horse the grim, hatless figure of a man clad in a coat of ancient gray. Joe was struck by a chill that made the autumn wind seem balmy. But he was a brave young man, and he demanded hoarsely, "In God's name, who are you? Why do you block my road?" The man in gray answered in a mild manner, "I will not harm you. Hear my message. Help me." His voice seemed to soothe the agitated horse, which then strayed a few feet and started nibbling on some grass. The sad voice continued, "Years ago I frequented this area trying to deliver the people from their evil ways. You are the first mortal who has not been afraid to speak to me. You have unsealed my lips and given me the chance to tell you who I am and why I have troubled travelers on this road for so many years. In life, I was a clergyman named Bryant. Long ago, I was riding through these plains, accompanied by Joseph Hasty, whose house I had spent the preceding night. We were overtaken by a settler named Warren. He was a bold man, but not one who listened to my preaching. He took Hasty aside, but I heard some of his evil urgings. He convinced Hasty that I had money, which was not so. I had only the gospel to give to the people. The voice rose in agony. The apparition pointed to a large tree beside the road on which the letter B had for years been deeply inscribed. Nobody knew how it came to be there. The voice went on, "That is the place. Beneath that tree, they murdered me." Joe looked at the tree with horror, and the ghostly figure spoke more calmly. "If you will read the 69th Psalm, you will know my feelings when I was in the hands of my enemies. Follow me, and I will show you where they laid me." Joe walked behind him through the thick oak branches and over the dry leaves, hearing no footsteps but his own. They came into a hollow several rods from the road, and the stranger said, "This is the lonely spot where they buried me. Break off some branches so that you may find it again. My mission is fulfilled. I will be at rest and will trouble this place no more." After breaking off some oak branches, Joe turned to speak to the stranger. There was no one there. Beneath the dark tree that night, shadows had already gathered, and Joe's fright returned. He wondered if the stealthy rustlings and stirrings of the forest were four-legged or two-legged animals. He stumbled out to the path, found his horse, and wasted no time in leaving Brian's Hollow, and its grisly secrets far behind him. Back in his home, Joe amazed his mother by asking her to read him the 69th Psalm. He hadn't been one to spend much time reading the Bible, so his mother obliged with great pleasure. She had noticed his agitated manner and his scratched hands and face when he entered the house. Now he became much calmer. He told his mother of the awful apparition he had seen. Now it was she who became excited. She told Joe of all the stories she had heard of the disappearance of Mr. Bryant and how Mr. Hasty had become afraid of his own shadow and would not go to the barn to milk the cows after dark unless his wife walked by his side. It was said by those who were with him at the time of his death that his fear at that time was shocking to see. "Was there any suspicion of Warren?" asked Joe. "Yes," said his mother. "He, as well as some others, were named in the gossip, but no one ever knew for sure what happened." She went on, "They said that he was also in an awful state of fear for 3 days before he died. Then he sent for a good man, and under a promise of secrecy, made a revelation to him. This seemed to ease his spirit before he died." The story of Joe's strange encounter spread through the countryside, but by the time he set out to mark the hollow shown to him by the spirit of Mr. Bryant, the whole area had been so trampled over and so many branches broken that Joe could never be sure of the place. All agreed that it was just as well the grave not be disturbed. From that day on, no traveler through Bryant's Hollow had ever been accosted by the apparition. The story persists of a strange aftermath of Joe's meeting with the ghost. It is said that then the elderly sister of Mr. Bryant, who was persistently disturbed by a dream in which she was urged to set out upon a journey to find the man who would tell her of her brother. When word of the last appearance of the ghost of the plains reached Mr. Bryant's old home, the sister was urged by then the exceedingly ancient mother to have faith in her dreams and put her trust in God to protect her on the dangerous journey in search of the man who had told her in her dreams that he would give her word of her brother. She bravely set out on horseback, passing through Shapley Corner. She was guided to the home of Joe and his mother. When she saw Joe, she cried out in great agitation, "You are the one who appeared to me in my dreams. Tell me truthfully all you know of my dear brother." When she heard Joe's story from his own lips, she too fell at peace. She thanked Joe warmly, saying, "Now my mother, who is old and ill, will be freed from worries before she dies." Great areas of the Shapley Plains are still in a wild state, but no doubt some builder of the future digging a cellar or well will come upon the bones of the Reverend Mr. Bryant and wonder what manner of man was buried alone in the wilderness so many years ago. Now, that's Julia Cook's story that she published in the Town Report in 1985. It's got a lot of detail in it. There's a lot of questions that it brings up, and a lot of pieces that you can start to piece together. The first time, and I'm going to go into what I have now. So, the first time that I remember hearing of this story was not from this Town Report story. It was from my father as we were coming back home from somewhere we had been. As we were crossing the plains, my brother Bruce was trying to scare me with the ghost story, and my father told him to stop his nonsense and explained to me that supposedly there was a preacher who had been hung by some robbers, and that people have claimed to have seen his ghost ever since. And in typical fashion of my father, he chalked it up to nothing more than an overactive imagination in a paper bag blowing in the wind. But when I asked him where they'd hung the preacher, he immediately said in Dead Man's Hollow, when he pointed out the place as we drove through it. Scoff though he would, my father, like everybody else in town, knew the story pretty good. So And he heard that story from probably his grandfather, my great-grandfather, who absolutely loved to tell stories. And that he was always, yeah. Late last spring, and Tracy's already kind of touched on this, but I want to touch on it a little too. Late last spring, the Historical Society hosted an art exhibit with works from local artist Sarah Tremblay. My brother Rick and I were both interested in the event because we both are very much into genealogy and local history. And we've been wanting to get into this building here to see what they had for information, and I'm thrilled that we did because there's a lot of really cool stuff in here, not the least of which is behind me, and I'll get into this in a few minutes. When we arrived and entered the building, one of the first paintings that we saw was that of a horse's head. There's this painting right here. The horse was obviously frightened, and I mean, Sarah done this is a fantastic, that you can see the fright in the horse's eyes. It's a fantastic painting. And I believe it was Tracy who came up to my brother and I and explained that this was Joe's horse from the Ghost of Shapley Plains. At which point we just looked at each other and smiled because this story is one that captured my interest years ago, and I've been researching it and the people around it for, say, probably 15, 20 years. Dave and I used to work together, and he remembers me coming to work, and it was always something new. So, make a long story short, my brother and I got together with Tracy and Jay, shared what we knew about the story, and well, here I am. So I'm terribly sorry about all of this. Julia Cook's version of this story is probably the most complete, and it's also the only one that I've ever found printed. There are other versions of this story. I did see one in another book on the ghosts of New England, I think, but it was almost identical to this, and I'm wondering if they found this story and published it. I'm not 100% sure about that, but this is probably the most complete version of the story that I have ever seen. It is, however, not the only version. Most versions of the story that I've heard all follow the same basic storyline that Julia Cook did when she wrote hers, but details in many of them differ. For instance, in the version that my father told me and my brothers when we were growing up, the preacher was hung and buried at the base of the tree. That's a detail that's not in Julia Cook's version of the story, but that's a detail that we picked up from our father. And it was interesting because when my brother Bruce finally came back up, he's just retired from the military, and when he finally came back up here, we didn't tell him what was going on, we just asked him a couple of questions, and he's like, yeah, well, that's how it happened. And so it was kind of confirming what we remembered as kids growing up too, so it was nice. Her version also leaves a couple of questions in the minds of the reader, and they're interesting questions. First, she states that Warren overtook Bryant and Hasty, and the two of them killed the minister in the woods. But when the settler Joe was talking to his mother about what happened, his mother tells him that there were others who were suspected. So how could anyone else have been suspected if this was a crime of opportunity that took place in the woods with only 3 people present and only 2 people returned? That's an interesting question. Secondly, she writes that the primary message that Bryant was preaching was the message of temperance. If Bryant was truly preaching against the evils of alcohol and abstinence from it, then he was truly a pioneer, as the temperance movement didn't begin until the 1820s. And it wasn't until 1834 that the first temperance society was formed in Maine. So that's another question, it doesn't really add up. And she also writes that money was the primary motive for killing the preacher. But again, why would Hasty lead a man into the wilderness, rob and kill him, when he could have simply taken his money while he slept at his house? So there's some questions there. And again, this was never meant to be a historical treatise on this or anything else like that. It's a folktale for telling around campfires and telling good stories. So now, in the way of full disclosure, I am probably not the best choice to present a ghost story. as I don't believe in ghosts. Sorry. But I don't necessarily believe that the story of Brian's disappearance is a ghost story. I think it's a story of people trying to carve out a life form in virgin wilderness of Maine after the Revolutionary War. It's a story, they were trying to bring law and order into an area that was left vacant when Cornwallis surrendered at Saratoga. There was nothing up here. There was no law. There was nothing. It was just you and an axe, and there's a chunk of land, and have fun, because that's it. So I think that's what this story is about more than it is a ghost story. So I want to start off with a basic presupposition. Namely, this story is true. Now, I don't mean the ghost, visions and dreams or anything like that, but the basic framework of the story here is true. There was an itinerant Baptist preacher who frequented Shapley. He did in fact stay at the home of Joseph Hasty and his wife. That Hasty did lead him away from the house the day he disappeared. That the preacher was killed. Hasty did experience what can only be described as a nervous breakdown before he died. And that the settler named Joe was made aware of the burial place of the preacher, and that's how the story began. I am not going to start in 1801 like Julia Cook did, because I believe this story has roots that go back a lot further than that. I want to start in 1760 in the town of Falmouth, present-day Portland, Maine. While I could not find any population data on Falmouth for 1760, the population of Portland in 1790 was 2,240 people. To put that into perspective, the town of Shapley, as of the 2020 census, has a population of 2,921 people. Okay. I say all that to say that Portland, or Falmouth as it was called then, was a small coastal town located in what we call the Old Port, and was a town that looked very different from the Portland that we know today. Okay. Within Falmouth, there was a congregation of Christian believers that was known simply as the First Church of Falmouth, later to be renamed the First Church of Portland. This congregation was founded in 1674, and by 1760 they were meeting in a framed structure at what is now the intersection of Temple and Congress Avenue. The present-day First Parish Unitarian Universalist Church sits on the site. You probably have driven by it if you've driven through Portland at all. There were two pastors laboring in this congregation in 1760. One was the Reverend Samuel Dean, and the other was the Reverend Thomas Smith. Reverends Dean and Smith had several lay leaders of historical note who assisted them in ministering to the congregation. One was Justice Longfellow, the great-grandfather of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Another of the lay leaders in the congregation was Deacon William Cotton, the great-nephew of Maria Cotton, wife of Increase Mather, who was the Puritan minister, president of Harvard University, and one of the prominent figures in the Salem witch trials of the 1690s. In addition to Deacon Cotton's great-aunt being married to Increase Mather, his great-grandfather was the Reverend John Cotton, another influential theologian in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as well as a political leader. One of Deacon Cotton's distant cousins was the Reverend Cotton Mather, son of Increase Mather, and also another prominent figure of the Salem witch trials. It's not surprising that with his family's Puritan pedigree, that Deacon Cotton was also a staunch Puritan. Deacon Cotton moved to Falmouth from Portsmouth, where he had worked for his father, who owned a tannery. When he settled into Falmouth, he purchased a tannery of his own at the intersection of 4th Street and Cotton Street, present-day parking lot, by the way, if you're interested. Deacon Cotton had 4 children with his first wife, Sarah Fletcher, who died in 1753. Sarah, William, John, and Abigail. He got remarried later, had another daughter named Mary. It was at the tannery on 4 and Cotton Street that Deacon Cotton plied his trade and taught it to his 2 sons, William and John, just as his father had taught him. I'm sure that one of the first things that William Cotton did upon arriving in Falmouth was to join in fellowship with the church at Falmouth, where they soon chose him to serve as deacon. In 1760, there was a religious controversy brewing, not only in Falmouth, but throughout all of New England. The controversy was not a new controversy. In fact, it had been around as long as the church itself. The controversy revolves around the question of limited atonement versus universal atonement. And without getting into a lengthy theological discussion, it comes down to a simple question. Did Christ die for the whole world, universal atonement, or did he only die for his elect, limited atonement? Simple question, but wars have been fought over that question. That was the question which was the basis of the Reformation that swept across Europe in the 1500s. And now it was once again being asked here in Maine. Those who, that's my granddaughter over there. Those who held to the doctrine of limited atonement were known as the Old Standing Order, or the Old Lights. And those who held to the doctrine of universal atonement were known as the Come-Outers, or the New Lights. The First Church of Falmouth was firmly in the camp of the Old Standing Order, not surprisingly with the Puritan pedigrees of the people that were in that church at that time. One of these Come-Outers, however, was John Cotton, one of Deacon Cotton's sons. John was born in 1741 and would have been 19 years old in 1760. In the book, A History of Gorham, Maine by Hugh McClellan, published in 1903, he is described in an understated manner where oftentimes more is said by less as a peculiar man. The book goes on to say that he was an honest and upright man with a great gift at prayer and exhortation, and a man who was of a very religious turn of mind, but was almost monomaniac on the subject of the Old Standing Order. The Reverend Thomas Smith, one of the pastors of the church there that Deacon Cotton was a member of, wrote of John Cotton exhorting and praying about the streets of Falmouth and disturbing him in his meetings. Reverend Smith went on to write that he thought the man to be insane. I would imagine that John Cotton's adherence to the New Lights doctrine and his very public and abrasive manner in which he denounced the Old Standing Order caused more than a little tension between he and his father, particularly in the light of the words of Reverend Smith. It was in 1760 that William, John's older brother, moved to Gorham with his wife Elizabeth and started a tannery there. Whether it was because of rising tension between John and his father, rising tension between John at the church at Falmouth, or a combination of both of those reasons, John soon followed his brother to Gorham and helped him with the tannery there. Tanning hides in the late 1700s was certainly not a glamorous job. First, the animal skins were cleaned. They were softened with water. Once cleaned, the tanners still had to pound the hides and remove the excess fat and flesh. Next, to loosen the hair follicles, they would soak the hides in an alkaline lime mixture. There are several ways to make such a mixture. One way, which the Cotton family probably used coming from coastal cities, is by burning oyster shells to create lime. And then they mixed the burnt up oyster shells with ash and water. And they soaked the hides in vats of this mixture. This is known as scudding. After the hides have been soaked in the vat of this mixture for several weeks, they are removed and the batting stage begins. In the batting stage, tanners work animal dung or brains into the skin, either by beating it with sticks or kneading them in a vat of feces and water. The combination of the bacteria enzymes found in the animal waste and the beating or kneading action fermented the skin and made it supple. Sorry, private joke. After the batting stage was complete, the tanner would stretch the hides on a wooden frame, immerse it in another vat of concentrated tannin, a chemical that is made from certain barks and tree leaves, and then they would leave the hides on a frame and allow them to dry in the sun. And if anybody's ever been around a tannery, you can imagine and understand why 18th century tanneries were almost always on the outskirts of town. Okay? And I know Russ has been around a tannery for a number of years. As John settled into the tanning business in Gorham, he continued his street preaching and exhortation as well as his one-man crusade against the old standing order. John would often make disturbances during the church services in Gorham as he had done in Falmouth. And that book, The History of Gorham, writes this about John Cotton's time in Gorham. It says, he often made disturbances in the meetings in Gorham by telling the Reverend Mr. Jewett when preaching that he lied, or by commencing his wild exhortation when services of the meeting were going on. He had to be removed from the house and put under keepers until the services were over, at which time he would work himself into a perfect frenzy, denouncing his opponents and persecutors, calling down the vengeance of heaven upon all and curses upon their head unto the last generation. So, all said, I think that John Cotton was definitely a peculiar man. As I said earlier, the tanning trade requires an alkaline lime mixture to soak the hides in. And the Cotton family, learning their trade as they did along the coastal cities, probably used oyster shells to make it. Gorham isn't exactly teeming with oyster beds, so either John or William would have had to make regular trips to the coast to get the shells they needed to make the lime mixture. Maybe it's because of the very public disturbances that John made in Gorham, but I believe it was John who made these trips to the coast. I think that William was probably more than a little relieved when they needed more lime so he could send John and get him out of town for a little while. Oyster beds are found all throughout the Scarborough marshes, and even today there are commercial oyster beds in the marshes. It is not hard to imagine John Cotton making his way from Gorham to Scarborough to harvest the oysters for the tannery. This isn't just speculation on my part, because in 1769, John married a woman from Scarborough named Rebecca Bryant. Now, not much is known about Rebecca Bryant, but we can deduce a few things about her from her husband. She was definitely not connected with the old standing order. With John's constant railing against the old lights, it would be totally out of character for him to marry a woman who was associated with what he was so adamantly preaching against. Now, while it's difficult to say for certain that she came from a religious family, I think the odds are pretty good that she did. John Cotton had already been described as a man of a very religious turn of mind. Coupled with his street preaching and public outbursts at services in both Gorham and Falmouth, lead me to believe that Rebecca knew full well what kind of man she was marrying. And you don't marry that kind of man unless you're in agreement with him. So I think it's pretty safe to say that not only did she come from a religious family, but a family who held to the doctrine of the New Lights. Perhaps it was on one of John's many trips from Gorham to Scarborough that he first felt the calling to become a circuit rider or an itinerant preacher. I imagine with his propensity for street exhortation that he made his way to Scarborough through Westbrook and then on to the village at Dunstan Corner. He preached to whomever would listen. I'm sure that there were those that when they saw him coming rolled their eyes and headed the other way, but there were probably those who listened, maybe gave him a little something in return for a message, food, drink, maybe a bit of coin. Perhaps when he returned to Gorham, rather than going back through Westbrook, he would return through the village at Salmon Falls and then turn north into Gorham. Perhaps there were families like the Bryants who were in agreement with his doctrine, and as a result overlooked the more interesting aspects of his personality. And whatever the case may be, after he and Rebecca were married, they returned to Gorham and started a family, and John Cotton began an itinerant preaching ministry throughout present-day York County. Once John and Rebecca were married, John's preaching circuit began to expand. Now, while we don't have any maps of the route that John took, we can make an educated guess based on the locations of the towns and villages. He would have probably started out by making his way from Gorham, heading east into Westbrook, and from there I think he would have turned south and moved on to Scarborough, perhaps staying with his in-laws. I think he probably would have avoided Falmouth and the problems that he had with the church there with his father. And from there, from Scarborough, there's a line of coastal villages at which he probably stopped. Kennebunk, Kennebunkport, Wells, York, Kittery, All of those right down the coast are right in line. There's nothing to indicate that John Cotton ever ventured into New Hampshire. So at Kittery, I think he probably turned north and made his way up the Piscataqua Salmon Falls River to the town of Berwick, present-day South Berwick. At the outset of the ministry in 1769, the northwestern part of York County, for the most part, was unsettled wilderness. So I think from Berwick, he would have probably turned northeast to Doughty Falls, present-day North Berwick, then on to Sanford, from there to the recently settled town of Alfred, on through the lumbering camps in the area known as Massabesic Plantation, Waterboro. From there, he probably turned northeast and made his way to the village at Salmon Falls and then home to Gorham. As more and more towns were settled, I think his route would have probably kept expanding and changing, but in 1769, I think it probably looked something like that. I would think that in the first few years, as Cotton's ministry grew and his trips got longer and developed more and more into a circuit, I think his ministry changed as well. Not necessarily the substance of it, but I'm sure that he very quickly realized that people are much quicker to lend an ear than they are to give a dime, especially to someone who's speaking out against the pastors they've all grown up with and have been ministering in their towns and communities for most, if not all, of their lives. So perhaps Cotton began to style his ministry after the Apostle Paul, who traveled around the Mediterranean as a tent maker. Or perhaps there was some other reason, but whatever the case may be, we do know that Cotton began carrying small amounts of trade goods, pots, pans, sewing needles, bits of leather to make shoes, medicines, among other things. Many of these items were difficult to come by, and in some of the smaller settlements and logging camps that he frequented, and trust in God though he did, I'm sure he found it much easier to get a good night's sleep on full stomach.
Mama.
When Cotton rode into Berwick in the fall of 1771, Berwick was a growing town bustling with activity. It was ideally situated on the Salmon Falls River so as to have easy access to the coast via the river and easy access to inland timber, which is the first real cash crop for the town. For nearly 100 years, English merchant ships and naval vessels had been getting mass-produced and rebuilt in Berwick. A byproduct of mass building are pipe or barrel staves, used to make barrels, which also became a major export as barrels were used to store nearly everything in the 18th century. In addition to masts and barrel staves, shipbuilding was a major industry at Berwick. And by 1770, 2 ships a year were being built in Berwick at Cow Cove and Pied Landing. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Berwick or not, but as you're going down Route 4 and you come to the New Hampshire border, you cross the river right there. If you look left, there's the falls that go down. At the base of the falls there, that is tidal. And they used to build ships there in Berwick and float them down the river to the Great Bay Area and out to sea that way. As a result, Berwick was filled with tradesmen, merchants, and others looking to make their fortunes. One such man was James Warren. James Warren was a young land surveyor and a lot layer for the town of Berwick in 1771, a post he was first elected to in 1764. James was the great-grandson of Scottish Covenanter James Warren, who had been captured by Oliver Cromwell at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, and eventually sold off as slave labor to the Great Works Mill in Berwick. 4 generations later, the Warren family was one of the most respected families in Berwick, with James IV serving as surveyor and lot layer, and James's uncle Gilbert serving as one of the town's constables. And this map behind me is one of the surveys, the original surveys of the town of Shapley. And this is an original James Warren survey map, so it's kind of interesting. After we finish up here tonight, if you want to take a peek at it, it's definitely worth looking at. Long before John Cotton rode into Berwick in 1771, James Warren married a young woman named Elizabeth Hastings. Elizabeth was the daughter of John and Jeanette Hasty, first-generation Irish immigrants who lived on the north side of Agamenticus, in an area of town that had originally been part of York until it had been set up to Berwick in 1713, where John operated a small sawmill with Elizabeth's brothers, Joseph, James, and Samuel. Not long after James and Elizabeth were married, James was elected to the office of Lot Lair, and soon after that, he and his cousin Gilbert, his uncle Gilbert's son, began a survey business in the town. James was soon employing his two brothers-in-laws, Joseph and Samuel, to work with him and Gilbert as chainmen, assisting with the surveys. And it was no doubt through his connection with Gilbert that Joseph and Samuel met their future wives. Joseph Hasty married Gilbert's sister Abigail in 1765, and Samuel Hasty married Gilbert's sister Lucy Joseph married in 1760 and Samuel married in 1765. So the group is starting to come together. And I know there's a lot of dates and a lot of names right now, and as we get forward a little bit further, I'll start tying everything together. Prior to 1770, the surveying that James, Gilbert, and Joseph had been doing consisted mainly of laying out roads for the town of Berwick, laying out property lines for people as they purchased land, and settling property disputes. That would soon change, however, as in 1770, the original deed to the Ossipee land tract was found in the papers of Francis Small. The deed conferred ownership of the present-day towns Acton, Shapley, Newfield, Parsonsfield, Limerick, and Lymington to Francis Small and his partner Nicholas Shapley. The deed was signed in 1661 by the chief of the Ossipee tribe, Chief Sunda, but had never been acted upon because of a long series of wars which are now referred to as the French and Indian Wars. The rediscovery of the deed in 1770 sparked a renewed interest in settling the northwestern part of York County. The heirs of Small and Shapley soon began to meet and discuss an equitable division of the tract of land, and they would soon need a skilled survey team to survey the tract of land. 1771 began as a very promising year for James Warren. James, who had by this time been one of the town's lot layers for years and was in March of 1771 elected to be a selectman for the town of Berwick, an office which he would hold for the next 12 years. James was a highly respected citizen in colonial Berwick, both for his skills as a surveyor and for his character as reflected by his election to that office of selectman. And I'm sure that James and Gilbert were all aware of the buzz of excitement concerning the meetings taking place among the heirs of Shapley and Small concerning the Ossipee land tract. And I'm sure that they were all aware that James's election as selectman put them in a very good position to be the surveyors for it. But for a year that began with so much promise, it did not end well for James. By the time James was elected to be selectman, he and his wife Elizabeth had 10 children, 2 of which were twins, Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha were 11 years old in 1771, and I'm sure that they were typical 11-year-olds full of energy and life. But in October of 1771, just about the time that Cotton would have been riding into town, Martha got sick, very sick. The records do not indicate what the sickness was, but they do indicate that she died on Sunday, October the 27th, 1771. Now, death of a child has got to be one of the most traumatic things a parent can go through. And I'm sure that the death of Martha devastated both James and Elizabeth. Martha's death would have also had a major impact on the rest of the family as well. Her twin Mary must have been devastated as James and Elizabeth. And I'm sure that Martha's siblings were all equally devastated. Gilbert and Joseph were more than merely business associates, they too were family. And I'm sure that they shared in James's pain as well. But as traumatic as the death of Martha Warren was, life would have to continue for the rest of the Warren family. March of 1772 saw James re-elected to both the office of selectman as well as the position of lot layer in Berwick. March of 1772 Also saw the proprietors meet and form a committee to go out to the Shapley land tract and make preliminary measures to possess the land. The committee consisted of two of the heirs, Joshua Hubbard and a man by the name of Dependent Shapley. These two men contracted James and secured the services of James and his crew to do the initial survey work of running a line around the claim. Preparations for the expedition were made both legally and logistically, and in May of 1773, the committee, along with James and his survey crew, ventured north into the wilderness to survey the border of what would become the town of Shapley. All in all, it seemed that Shapley was on the fast track to settlement, much to the delight of the proprietors. That was in the spring of 1773. By the end of the year, however, things looked much different in Berwick and for the colonies as a whole. Ever since the end of the French and Indian Wars in 1763, tensions between Great Britain and the colonies had been increasing. A series of unpopular acts had been passed by Parliament, beginning with the Stamp Act in 1765, followed by the Townshend Act in 1767, and in 1770, the British Army opened fire on a group of unarmed civilians in Boston, killing 5, in the event that has become known as the Boston Massacre. Then, on the 16th of December, 1773, a group of colonials dressed as Native Americans boarded several ships owned by the East India Trading Company and threw an estimated 10,000 pounds worth of tea into the Boston Harbor, in the event that became known as the Boston Tea Party. Not 2 weeks after this tea party, the leaders of the town of Berwick got together and composed a document to send to Boston showing their solidarity with those who had thrown the tea into the harbor and vowing to do the same at Portsmouth if the East India Company tried to collect taxes on tea there as well. This document was signed by 13 of the town's leaders. Signers of this document included Captain Ichabod Goodwin Sr., General Ichabod Goodwin Jr. General Ichabod Goodwin Jr., by the way, was commander of forces at Saratoga just a few years later. Colonel William Rogers. And this is where it gets interesting for me, because when I found this document, it was just like, oh wow, cool. Darling Huntress Sr. and Gilbert Warren, whom we've already talked a little bit about. By signing this document, the 13 signers were effectively committing treason against the crown. Somebody one time said that it's only treason if you lose. So, this was it. Beginning in March of 1774 with the Boston Port Act, and going through June of 1774 with the Quebec Act, Britain's Parliament passed a series of acts aimed to punish the colonials for their defiance. These acts became known as the Intolerable Acts and were a key development leading up to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. In response to these acts, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on the 5th of September, 1774. On the 23rd of March, 1775, Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And on the 19th of April, 1775, tensions between the colonials and the British reached the boiling point when the British Army attempted to seize a cache of weapons at Lexington, Concord. And on the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress ratified the Declaration of Independence. Young men and old from all over the colonies flocked to join local militias. One such man was 21-year-old Darling Huntress Jr., whose father, Darling Huntress Sr., had been one of the town leaders who had signed the document declaring Berwick's solidarity with the Boston Tea Party. In 1776, Darling Huntress Jr. joined with Captain Jonathan Hamilton's militia company under the command of Colonel John Frost of the 2nd Regiment of the York County Militia. Another man who joined in 1776 was Samuel Hasty, Joseph and Elizabeth Hasty's younger brother. He joined Captain Abel Moulton's company, also under the command of Colonel John Frost, in December of 1776. The second, they were deployed, the entire 2nd Regiment of the Airplane Militia was deployed to Peekskill, New York, just south of West Point on the Hudson River. In late December 1776, just after Washington crossed the Delaware, surprising the Hessian garrison at Trenton, the Colonials captured a man at Peekskill by the name of Daniel Strang. Daniel Strang was a Tory sympathizer and was accused of being a spy and attempting to raise troops for the British. A general courts-martial was convened, and on the 4th of January 1777, Strang pled innocent to the charges of espionage and guilty to the charge of attempting to raise soldiers for the British. Strang was found guilty on both counts and sentenced to death. On the 7th of January 1775, Daniel Strang was placed in a cart in front of a regimental formation, a rope placed around his neck, and at a signal from the colonial officer in charge, the cart was drawn away, leaving Strang hanging by the neck in front of the regiment of militia. This was known as a short drop hang, which means the prisoner's neck was not snapped, and he was left strangled. The long drop hanging method was not developed until 1866. Death from a long drop hang was almost always instantaneous due to the condemned person's neck breaking at the C2 level and severing the spinal cord. But death from a short drop hang usually took 10 to 20 minutes for the condemned to strangle to death. So the entire regiment was kept in formation in the frigid January air and forced to watch as Daniel Strang slowly strangled to death for crimes of treason and raising troops for the enemy. It was kind of a message to the regiment, I guess. In that formation stood Darling Huntress Jr. and Samuel Hasty. After Daniel Strang was pronounced dead, he was buried at the base of the tree, and his initials were carved into that tree as a marker. And that'll be important a little bit. The Revolutionary War went on after Daniel Strang was hanged at Peekskill. The early defeats of the Colonials at Bunker Hill, the burning of Falmouth, the Battle of Long Island, and the Battle of White Plains were being replaced by Colonial victories at Trenton, Princeton, Saratoga, and Gloucester. Colonial farmers joined with local militias for a few months at a time, or with the Colonial Line, as the Army was then called, or with the Navy for a year or more. Such was the case with the Hasties, Warrens, and Huntresses. Joseph Hasty served as a private in Colonel Tupper's 15th Massachusetts in 1779. Samuel served on at least 2 different occasions. First time was with Captain Moulton under Colonel Frost, and the second time was with Captain Hodson under Colonel Poor in 1779. Darling Huntress Jr. also served on at least 2 separate occasions, the first time being in Captain Hamilton's company under Colonel Frost, and then again he served in Captain Ricker's company under Colonel Goodwin in 1780. Aaron Warren, James Warren's son, served first as surgeon's mate on the schooner Fly in 1777, and then in the Continental Line in 1778 through 1780. Gilbert Warren also served in the Continental Line, though the year of the unit wasn't given. So life goes on even in times of war. And all these men would serve for a bit, come home, pick up their lives, and then go and serve again. James Warren and his crew were employed several times by the Shafted proprietors. In 1773, 74, 76, and again in 78. James and his crew were paid by a combination of money and land for their services. In 1778, Darling Huntress Jr. married Mary Warren, James and Elizabeth's daughter, who was the surviving twin. In 1780, the proprietors of the Shapley claim granted to Gilbert Warren, Joseph Hasty, Samuel Hasty, and Darling Huntress Jr. 100 acres of land each, upon which they all soon were settled into the township. The more I've studied that out, the more I've come to the realization that was land that they were paid for the services as surveyors. James Warren, who was the lead surveyor of that team, never moved to Shapley, which is why I think he gave that land that he was paid to his daughter and son-in-law, Darling Huntress, which is how our family ended up coming up here to Shapley. In 1782, James and Elizabeth's son Aaron married Darling Huntress Jr.'s sister Kezia, and they too moved to Shapley. Soon, the logging camp on the Mowsum River had turned into a town, and on the 5th of March, 1785, Shapley was incorporated as the 43rd town in the York District of Massachusetts. As the untouched wilderness gave birth to logging camps, and logging camps grew into towns, and trees were cut, and the landscape changed, so too did the preaching circuit of John Cotton. Looking at the map, his route would have probably change and continue from South Berwick along the Salmon Falls River to Berwick, and then north into Lebanon, and then on to the village at Emery's Mills, and then to Shapley Corner. Perhaps Bryant continued on a northerly route, taking him into Parsonsfield, a town that was incorporated the same year as Shapley. And from there turning a westerly track following the Saco River into what would become Cornish, Leamington, Standish, and finally back into Gorham. At about the time that Gilbert, Joseph, Samuel, and Darling were making the move from Berwick to Shapley in 1781, there was a new town that was being settled on the Saco River by Joseph Thompson, Cornish. And Cornish had rich, productive soil for farming, and it wasn't long before the new town was founded. Now, whether it was because of pressure from the local churches in Gorham, or pressure from his brother tired of the controversy that seemed to follow John Cotton, or perhaps there were other reasons for John and Rebecca to leave Gorham, but sometime after the 1790 census and before 1794 when Cornish was incorporated, John and Rebecca made the move from Gorham to Cornish. As changed as the landscape was both politically and with towns literally began popping up all over York County, John Cotton's message and method of delivery were still the same as they were in Gorham and again in Portland. In the town records of Cornish, it is noted that he, Cotton, gained by his fanatical enthusiasm the nickname the Mad Preacher. So, evidently John Cotton has not changed a bit. Sometime in the 1790s, a new denomination began to appear throughout New England. This denomination had begun in New Durham, New Hampshire, through the work of John Randall around 1780, and called itself Free Will Baptists. You probably have driven around and you've seen churches around with Free Will Baptist name in front of them and stuff, and that's originally from that denomination. By 1785, 12 congregations had been formed throughout Maine and New Hampshire, one of which was located in Gorham. The Free Will Baptists were exactly what John Cotton needed to further his own ministry. They stood in opposition to the old lights and the old standing order, and they had in fact broken away from the group known as the Particular Baptists because of their strict views on predestination. It wasn't long until John had joined in fellowship with the Free Will Baptists, and they, in 1790, made him an elder and an unordained preacher under the oversight of the Reverend James McCorson. But even here, among like-minded believers, things did not go smoothly for John. Again, according to the book The History of Gorham, he, Cotton, was often brought before the quarterly meetings for his singularities. At one meeting, it was concluded that John Cotton has a gift to improve the church, but it's possible that he has sometimes spoken too much, or often spoken after he should have left off. In 1811, the denomination published a history of their denomination. And in this history, they speak of Cotton. And this is what they had to say about it. This Cotton had an excellent gift of exhortation, but it may be said of him, as it was of Elias, that he's a man subject to like passions as we are. And sometimes his zeal for God carried him to great length and exposed him to great persecutions. And the publication went on to say, he was often pushed about and smitten by the people, sometimes stoned. And I have been informed by those who were acquainted with those circumstances, more than once dragged out of a meeting house by his heels and dragged some distance from the house in the street in the same manner. So he was not necessarily a popular face around town. I can remember being in a class at Bob Jones University called Pulpit Speech, or more commonly referred to as Preacher Boys. One of the first things that we were taught was never to allow the messenger to get in the way of the message. John Cotton was a man who certainly allowed his personality to get in the way of the message that he was trying to convey. While Cotton's problems continued to mount through the 1780s and 90s, the newly incorporated town of Shapley flourished, giving opportunity to those who had chosen to relocate there. Gilbert Warren built a small lumber mill on the Pump Box Brook. That's the area down behind the church at the corner. If you go down along the brook, you can still see the old stones of the mill that was down there. And was soon elected to serve in various town offices. Samuel Hasty was elected to serve as Surveyor of Highways, an office responsible for laying out and upkeep of the roads in town. In 1786, Darling Jr. was elected to town office for the first time as a Surveyor of Highways and as a field driver and fence viewer. At least 2 companies of town militia were then formed, which were comprised mainly of the Revolutionary War veterans. Word of opportunities spread back to Berwick, and James and Elizabeth Warren's son, Aaron, who married Darling Jr.'s sister in 1782, relocated to Shapley in 1785, where he began to practice medicine. Darling Huntress Jr.'s brother Ichabod also relocated to Shapley, as did his sister and her new husband, John Wadley. They both came and they both served in various town offices in town as well. Darling served almost continually in town offices for the next 50 years, from everything from hog reeve, fence driver, to selectman and town treasurer. He also rose to the rank of major in the town militia, and eventually would be referred to in the town records as Esquire, which is a distinction which is reserved for lawyers and justices of the peace. He was a successful mill owner and always was found on the qualified list of jurors in Shapley. The years from 1785 through 1800 were busy years for both the town of Shapley and those who relocated there. Land was being cleared for its timber and turned into farmland. Roads were being laid out through the town and bridges were being built, homes were constructed, children were being born. All said, that first 15 years or so of Shapley were a very busy time. And this buzz of activity is the buzz that greeted Cotton whenever he came into town on his yearly trek through York County. And doubtless, there were those who were less than happy to see this man ride into town, but there were those who welcomed him and, despite his peculiarities, listened to him and the message that he preached. One such man was Joseph Hasty. It's unclear if Hasty's connection with Cotton began in Berwick or if it was in Shapley after he relocated there. But whenever Cotton would come to town, he would stay at the home of Joseph and Abigail Hasty. I imagine that Joseph Hasty was the quiet sort of man. Of the group of settlers that came up from Berwick, he is the only one who never held a town office. Gilbert Warren, Darling Huntress each built mills in town. Samuel Hasty, John Wadley, and Ichabod were all lumbermen. Aaron Warren not only had a medical practice, but it's noted in the town records that he was selected on several different occasions to repair bridges in town that had fallen into disrepair. Joseph Hasty, however, led a quiet and unassuming life. Once his land, which lay between Darling and Samuel's farm, was cleared, he farmed it and occasionally opened up his house to travelers, giving them a place to stay. It doesn't appear that he had any aspirations for town leadership. As far as religious sentiments go, I would have to imagine they were in line with Cotton and the Free Will Baptists, since Cotton kept staying with him whenever he was in town. When John Cotton rode into town in the fall of 1800, It probably seemed like every other time that he came to town. But no one realized that this particular trip to Shapley would have dire consequences, not only for Cotton, but for the group of settlers from Berwick. It was that fall, the fall of 1800, that 40-year-old Mary Warren Huntress, Darling Huntress Jr.'s wife, would unexpectedly die. Mary was a healthy woman. She and Darling had 8 children together, the last being born in 1791. There's nothing in the records to indicate that she had any health problems. So for her to die suddenly in the fall of 1800 must have come as a shock, for not only for Darling, but for the entire group that had come up from Berwick, which now included Mary's brother Aaron. But as it did for the Warren family in 1771, the death of Mary's twin sister, life moves forward, and move forward it did. But it wasn't the same for the group from Berwick. Something had changed. Darling was elected as selectman in 1801, and he would go on again to be elected in 1803, and as treasurer in 1819. While everything seemed to be going great for Darling, it wasn't so for some of the others from Berwick. Joseph Hasty died in 1805 after suffering what can only be described as a nervous breakdown. Aaron Warren abandoned his medical practice in 1806 and moved to Wells and became a Quaker. According to the history of Wells, he made a meager living by collecting reeds and making baskets. Became a basket weaver. Ichabod Huntress, according to the town records, spent time in the Elford jail, though it's not said why. Gilbert Warren sold his mill at Pump Box Brook and went back to Berwick sometime after 1801, and nothing else can be found on him until his death in 1809. Samuel Hasty worked on his farm, barely scraping by, and finally in 1833, Darling Huntress gave a sworn affidavit on behalf of Samuel in order to get him his pension for his Revolutionary War service. Samuel Hasty died just a year later in 1834. Finally, after 1800, I can find no more mention of John Cotton. There are no more accounts of his being dragged out of local churches by his heels, being stoned. There are no records of his death. There's no records of where he's buried. He just vanishes from the records. Now, what I just relayed are facts. And as close as I can get it, that is what happened to that group of people from Berwick, John Cotton and company, as they all worked and lived and settled in this area. What I'm about to do is go into pure speculation at this point. Coincidences, maybe. Sometimes coincidences start to pile up and you start to go, maybe there's more than a coincidence here. So as I researched the historical books and family genealogies of this group of people, I've tried to stick to verifiable facts with a few exceptions. One of the exceptions that I was not factual here was the root of John Cotton. But again, I think we can make a pretty fair assumption on his route based on the settlement dates of those towns and where he would have been going, because that would have been the only location of people in the area. The disappearance of Bryant took place over 200 years ago, and we will never be able to say with certainty what or if it really happened. All we can do is speculate. Based on what Julia Cook put down on paper and what I've heard from my family and other old-timers in town, and in light of the facts that I've been able to find, I do have a hypothesis on what happened in the fall of 1801. Keep in mind, it's only a hypothesis. It's very fluid and is based on the facts that I currently know. It could change tomorrow if some other facts, if I find some other fact that's going to shed new light on something, and so it could change. Okay? This is definitely not concrete. Let's start with the Reverend Bryant. Nowhere in the records that I have read through has there been a single mention of an itinerant Baptist preacher named Bryant. Now, there is one exception to that I just learned a week ago, 2 weeks ago, in the records of the Shapley Church, that there's copies here. There was mention of the disappearance of Bryant in those records. So I'm curious, I'm going to be getting a hold of those and reading through those records again. So I'm curious about that. As I wrote this, I hadn't heard that yet, so keep that in mind. But I believe that there's no real record of Brian because I believe that he is actually John Cotton. I believe he started using his wife's last name in order to separate himself from his family name of Cotton. That was a staunch Puritan name with a huge, huge pedigree. And for somebody like John Cotton, I'm sure that grated on his nerves, and I'm sure that every time he showed up at the church to preach, everybody's expecting one thing, and when he opens up his mouth, it's different. So I think he started using his wife's name, and with all of his peculiarities and fervor, it's not a stretch to think that he would choose to use his wife's name and not his own. I also believe that after the Revolutionary War, he began carrying trade goods and medicine and anything else that could be easily taken to earn a bit of coin. After the war, currency was scarce, and even in the Berwick Town records, there's several petitions that are recorded that were sent to the governor of Massachusetts asking the state to do something about the currency shortage. People were delinquent in paying their taxes because there just wasn't anything to pay them with. They had no money. It would have been very difficult for an itinerant preacher to earn coin during that time. So I believe he went more to a barter system and that he would trade things for meals, either services or goods. Julia Cook writes that Bryant carried medicine with him. Medicine at that time was a very loose term, to say the least. It was in the late 1800s. Some of you probably know about this. There was a tonic that veterinarians used to give to sick horses. Today we know that as Moxie. So medicine was a very loose term at that point. So I think that the medicine that Bryant probably carried with him was some sort of a homebrew tonic that was intended to be a panacea for all sorts of ills. Which brings me to Berwick on Sunday the 27th of October 1771. And to Shapley on Sunday the 23rd of November 1800. Mary and Martha Warren were twins. And twins often share more than looks. They often share the same health conditions, allergies, etc. I believe that Mary and Martha shared a food allergy. I believe they were allergic to shellfish. This allergy would not have been a problem for the Warrens as they did not live on the coast, and while the Great Works River is tidal below the falls, it's not saltwater and does not contain any shellfish. I would also speculate that they did not know of this allergy. I think that Martha, when she got sick in 1771, and perhaps got some of Bryant's tonic, I think the tonic that he made was probably tainted with shellfish due to the method of canning that the Cotton family used, burnt oyster shells to make the lime. So I believe that when she took that, she died of anaphylaxis. I also believe that Mary, years later, in the town of Shapley, also got sick, and she too got some of Bryant's tonic, who again was in town shortly before or during the time where she died. And I believe it too was tainted with shellfish, and she also died of anaphylaxis. And that brings me to Aaron Warren. Aaron Warren would have been 13 years old when his sister Martha died in Berwick. I'm sure that watching her die was a very traumatic experience for a 13-year-old boy, especially in light of the fact that if she did die from anaphylaxis, okay, you're basically watching somebody throat swell up and they suffocate to death. Not a real pleasant experience to watch. So I think watching her die changed Aaron. He would go on to study medicine like his cousin, the Dr. Benjamin Warren from Boston, who would rise to fame as commander of the colonial forces at Bunker Hill. During the Revolution, it's noted that Aaron was the surgeon's mate on the schooner Fly, and once he settled into Shapley, he had a medical practice in town. When his sister Mary died in 1800, I think he immediately recognized that she died in the same manner as Martha, and he began to put two and two together. And the common denominator was Bryant's medicinal tonic. Which brings me to Darling Huntress. Of the group of settlers from Berwick, Darling Huntress was by far the largest personality. He was a well-respected and influential town leader who was now a senior leader in the town militia. I believe that Darling was approached by his brother-in-law Aaron Warren after Mary's death, and Aaron told him of the similarities in Mary and Martha's death and the connection with Bryant's tonic. I believe that Darling and Aaron began making plans for Bryant's return to Shapley the following year. I believe that Darling, in light of his position, both as a civic and military leader, viewed himself as an officer of the law and began to put together a group, probably all of whom were members of the militia as well, who would apprehend Bryant and find out what was going on. The first person he probably got, other than Aaron, was Samuel Hasty, because both he and Samuel had been at Peekskill, New York for the trial and subsequent hanging of Daniel Strang. And while Darling might have considered himself an officer of the law, that was the only experience he had in a trial setting, and Samuel had the same experience. Others of the group probably included his brother Ichabod, whose farm was the last one on the way out of the village at Shapley Corner, Gilbert Warren, and finally Joseph Hasty. As I have said, I think Joseph Hasty was a quiet and unassuming man, and I think that he genuinely liked Bryant/Cotton and enjoyed his company. I imagine that at first he wanted nothing to do with what was being proposed by Darling and Aaron. I think that Darling and Aaron, possibly even his brother Samuel, put constant pressure on Joseph Hasty to help him out. Joseph would have been central to any part or any plan that was formed because Bryant would stay with him when he was in town. Maybe they convinced him to help them by telling him they only wanted to talk to him. Maybe they put a guilt trip on him about Mary and Martha. Maybe it was a little bit of both. Whatever the case may be, Joseph Hasty led Bryant out of town on that day in late October of 1801. I believe that Joseph Hasty led him to a predetermined spot outside of town with Bryant/Cotton's flair for the dramatic. They didn't want a circus to ensue. I think that when they arrived at that location, Darling and the rest of the group were waiting, and Darling, a senior ranking member of the group, convened what was essentially a military court-martial like he had seen at Peekskill, New York. I think the group waiting for Bryant had probably already made up their minds before he and Joseph Hasty arrived at the court-martial. I believe that the court-martial was merely perfunctory. Darling, as the president of the court-martial, would have found him guilty and then sentenced him to death. The group then hung Bryant by the neck until he was dead. Again, this would have been a short drop hang, much like the hanging of Daniel Strang, and the group would have had to have watched as he slowly strangled to death. I think watching a man strangled to death, especially one who he had breakfast with that morning and who stayed in his house, probably broke Joseph Hasty. I think that after the hanging, they buried Bryant's body at the foot of the tree as they had done with Strang in New York, and after they were finished, I think they marked the tree with the initial B, which is what we heard in Julia Cook's version of the story. I think Joseph Hasty was racked with guilt over what had transpired, and I think it gnawed at him. And Joseph began to experience paranoia, which is one of the symptoms of a nervous breakdown. And you will have to excuse me, I'm not a medical professional, I'm just going by what I read on the internet. So I do apologize, Kara. Another of the symptoms is irritability, which Julie Cook described in her version when Joseph finds out that his wife Abigail has been talking about Bryant's disappearance around town. Yet another symptom is fearfulness. And again, Cook writes that Joseph was scared of his own shadow and wouldn't even go out into the barn unless his wife went with him. I think that as Joseph's mental state deteriorated, he began going back to where they had buried Bryant, probably to pray for forgiveness and for what they had done. I believe that it was Joseph Hasty's whispered prayers not far off the road that spooked horses in the area as they were going through. I think that sometime in July of 1805, this settler Joe was riding through the area and his horse spooked. Perhaps Joe heard something himself and went to investigate and saw Joseph at the foot of the tree praying and talking to himself. I think that Joe might have stayed quiet and listened and heard Joseph tell at least part of the story in the form of whispered prayers and pleadings for forgiveness. I think Joe heard what happened and heard the names Warren mentioned and maybe heard Joseph mumble something about others. I think Joe went home and talked to his mother about what he had seen. And the reason that I believe this all took place in July of 1805 is because on the 1st of August of 1805, Joseph Hasty died. And in no story that I have ever heard or read or anything else was he ever confronted by anyone in town about his role in the disappearance. I think that Joe did go to the town leadership after Joseph Hasty died to bring him to the site where he had seen Joseph and the grave of Brian. I think the person that he went to, though, was one of the senior leaders in the town militia, Darling Huntress. I think that Darling listened intently to Joe and got a group together to go with this guy out to this place. And I think that group probably included Samuel Hasty, Aaron Warren, Gilbert Warren, Ichabod Huntress, and maybe some others. The group headed out of town with Joe leading the way. Maybe it was having Aaron Warren and Gilbert Warren in the party that got Joe thinking as they rode, or maybe that the others mentioned in the gossip, or maybe Darling and Aaron are talking to each other as they rode, just loud enough for Joe to hear about, how odd it was that Joe should know where the grave of this missing man was. And maybe the question was asked, how do you suppose he knows where this dead guy's buried? It's a good question. Whatever the case may be, I think Joe started to put two and two together and realized that he was headed out of town to a remote area with a group of people who more than likely had killed a Baptist minister. That's not a good position to be in. I think Joe came to the realization that he was either going to end up next to the minister or be blamed for his death. So when they came to a spot that looked close enough, I think Joe said, yeah, this is it. The spot that he pointed out is, I think, what we all know as Brian's Hollow today. That's where the Goose Pond turnoff takes off from Route 11. That's where people have always told, say, that's Brian's Hollow. And that's not where my father said it was. But that's another story. I think he said that was the place as a means of self-preservation. The reason that no grave has ever been found is because they were in the wrong spot. After Joe's leading the party out of town, I think Darling and the group would have returned to the area where they had buried Brian, cut the tree down that marked his grave, and maybe cut a bunch of other trees in the area to make it more difficult for anyone to find the exact spot again. Perhaps it was Joe's attempt to lead the town to Brian's grave, or perhaps it was watching his uncle slowly lose it over the last 4 years, whichever the case may be. In Orrin Warren's book on the genealogy of the Warren family, I love that name, huh? Orrin Warren. What kind of parent does that? Which was published in 1806. Warren's book on genealogy. He writes that in 1806, Aaron Warren, now this is shortly after Joseph Hasty died, Aaron Warren abandoned his medical practice and moved to Wells and became a Quaker. It's recorded in the history of Wells that when Aaron moved there, his religious sentiments, he was in accord with the Friends, or the Quakers. He lived a quiet life in Wells and making baskets from pond reeds. There are some indications in the town records, though, that either he moved back to Shapley, or there was also another Aaron Warren, perhaps one of his sons, because there are Aaron Warrens in the records after that. So either he came back or he had a son that was in the area. Gilbert Warren, again, sold his mill in 1806. Darling's brother Ichabod spent time in jail in 1809. The reason wasn't given. Usually, if the reason wasn't given in the town records, it's because it was due to debt collection and wasn't paying the taxes, or there was financial issues, and it was a debtor's prison. Which means that Ichabod had fallen onto hard times sometime after 1806. Samuel lived the rest of his life on a small farm on what is now Norton Ridge Road. Toward the end of his life, his pension, Darling had to write a sworn affidavit to make sure he got his pension. The pension wasn't much, but evidently it was enough to keep him financially solvent. You know, Darling, of the group, Darling is the only one who prospered. Afterwards, he went on to become the town treasurer in 1819. He ran for state rep as well as county treasurer, continued to run a mill in town until he died in 1838. And again, as for John Cotton, after 1800, the man just simply vanishes. There are no other records of John Cotton after 1800. Now, much of what I said, like I said, can be chalked up to coincidence. Cotton, peculiar and controversial preacher, marrying a woman with the last name Bryant. Right? Maybe that's a coincidence. Mary and Martha Warren, both dying around the same time Cotton was in town, albeit 30 years apart. Maybe that's coincidental. Bryant being buried, or buried in the same manner as Daniel Strang from Peekskill, you know, with Darling and Samuel Hasty Jr. present. Maybe that's coincidence too. Like I said, when the coincidences start piling up, when you start adding things together, maybe there's more than coincidence there. Who knows? Whatever the case may be, I don't think that if it happened this way, I don't believe that John Cotton was a malicious man. I think he was just trying to make ends meet on the road. And I don't think he intentionally was out to hurt anybody. I think his panacea tonic was probably a little more than moxie. It just happened to have some shellfish taint in it from his job as a tanner when he was back home. I don't think that that group of settlers, I don't think that they were doing anything that they thought was evil or malicious. I think they were trying to create law and order in an area where there wasn't any. You know, it is interesting. There's a lot of interesting things there and a lot of fun things there to study and to research. And if you enjoy local history, York County's full of interesting stuff about what went on in this county. So that is all I have for tonight as far as what I've written down. If you have questions, by all means, I can take a few questions. None. All right, goodbye. I know this went on an awful long time, and I do apologize. Yes, Rick.
Just explain to them